The new erosion nodes for high field terrains have some really cool outputs, and what I want to show you right now is a baked terrain, or at least not a baked, but an exported image from a terrain. And we're going to go ahead and create a procedural terrain out of it, which is a really easy way to use an image map that you have, at least a 32-bit image map, to generate a terrain from the image. So first, let's take a look at the terrain editor and how to export. Up at the top here, we have an export terrain option. And now, for image-based exports, it's only going to work for 2D terrains and not with the 3D sculpted terrain. And I suggest the EXR format for this. Usually works really well. If I go ahead and select to save, what I'm going to do is choose the EXR format and hit save. And this is going to pull up a couple of options. I do suggest whenever you export EXRs from View that you turn off the Use Alpha option. And then for compression, I usually use the PIS-based wavelet, which works really nicely. I'm not going to go ahead and save this one out. So I've already prepared an image, and unfortunately, because of file sizes, I'm not going to be able to include this with the training. But here is the elevation output, and this is 8K. And this was generated from a height field terrain using the flow surface erosion node. Or actually, the flow channels erosion node. Flow surface is one of the outputs, which we're going to take a look at as well. So this actually took about 20 minutes to generate. And then what I was able to do is after the terrain was generated, I was able to export it. One thing that you need to do for terrains that use the erosion nodes is you may need to render it first in the scene and then reopen the terrain editor in order to see the processed effect. But what we're going to do right now is reset the function, and we're using procedural terrain. I'm going to turn off zero edges and edit the function. And what we're going to do is add in a texture map, and I'm going to use a projected texture map, which is going to fit to the bounds of the terrain because we have object parametric mode turned on. And I'll go ahead and load in an image. I also want to note these file sizes can be rather large. This one with the PIS-based wavelet is about 512 megs, and without that compression, it ends up being about 768 or so. So once View has these loaded in for the first time, it creates a recent file section within the browser. And once you go to select an image, you can see it's hanging right now because I selected this image earlier. It's in my recent files, and what View's actually doing is putting it into the memory already, even though I just am browsing files. So that's one thing to watch out for. What I ended up doing with all of these 8K outputs that I have, and we're going to take a look at those in Photoshop while that's processing. I created all of these different ones, and I actually had to move them out of a different folder because it was taking so long for View to load those images. So here's the recents that show up, and most of these are just terrain brushes I was using, but right here is that 8K erosion, and that's what was hanging it up. And when you have a whole bunch of these within the recent files, it just can take a really long time for View to load. So you can either bypass this by going into the options and using the system browser rather than using the View browser. Some areas of the program I like to use the View browser, but for images, this can create some real problems. So moving along, I'm going to select the elevation map, and I'm going to once again wait for that to load. So I'll go ahead and just pause really quick. And actually, if you do get this message, you can just wait for View to respond, because it will, but right now it's loading that image in. This is one of the drawbacks to using exported images. It does take a little bit longer. And now it's loaded in. So what I'm going to do is connect the altitude output to this grayscale output of this image, and we can see that start to show up. What I also want to do is set the interpolation type to bicubic, because otherwise we're going to get some pixelated looks because the procedural terrain will continually divide itself. But a nice thing is we don't have to process it too high or generate the geometry from that image too much. One nice thing about the new high field terrains is since we can use the function, we don't necessarily have to use the procedural terrain, but it will require increasing the resolution up to, in this case, what would be 8K. So I'm going to leave it as it is right now. Go ahead and click OK, and then I'll just scale this down a little. And here we have the terrain. And I'm going to go ahead and just do a quick render of it. You can see what it looks like. And now, here's one of the advantages of using an image. The advantage is we don't have to wait for the terrain to process every time we open the scene file, which is what's going to happen with the erosion nodes. If you do not export them, it will have to reprocess, because otherwise the file sizes will be rather large. And Vue has a tendency to knock you out of the program and show what's behind it sometimes when you're finished rendering. Let's go back and see if I can see that render. So here is the exported terrain. And this will, of course, subdivide itself as you move closer into it. But if you do want a fixed resolution, then you can use a height field terrain for that and just keep subdividing. But I thought this was a cool opportunity to show you some of the other outputs that are available without having to do too much testing. So there's quite a few outputs for the erosion nodes, and I'll go ahead and just show you kind of the setup I had for this terrain just by adding one in really quick and editing the object. And this is a height field, and we can take a look at the erosion node. So we're going to go to height field, and I'm going to do erosion custom and just set this to flow channels, which is what I used. Now there's a bunch of different outputs from here. We've got altitude, flow surface, flow speed, flow vector, flow depth, transported sediment, and displaced soil. Some of these options are really more specific to certain types of erosion. Displaced soil, for this one I usually only get like a blank image output. But these you can use either to control other functions or other nodes within the graph, or we can use them to control materials. So let's take a look at a couple of the outputs I got from these settings. So if we go, I'm just going to go back into Photoshop where I got these images open. So this is the elevation. And another one that's very similar to the elevation, it's only a little bit different, is the flow surface. It's just slightly different. You can notice right here, in comparison to here, it is a little bit different. That could be possibly caused by the way that Vue exports the terrain and condenses it, but there's very little difference that I've seen between those two. Flow depth is great for material distribution. We can get all those little channels in there, and you can see the amount of detail we get out of this is really pretty good. So this is a great looking output image of the erosion that we can see, and we can use that to control material distribution. We can get those fine little lines, and if we need more out of it, obviously we can edit the image. Now if you're using Photoshop without an OpenEXR a plugin, then I do not suggest using the EXR format, just because Photoshop by default will only save EXRs in 16-bit, and this is a 32-bit image. For material distribution, it shouldn't matter too much. It's more about the elevation that makes a big difference. So I guess in this case it would be okay. But that's one thing to keep in mind for elevation. If you don't have a plugin for it to allow you to save in 32-bit, then you gotta watch out for that. So the other one, we're going to take a look at this really cool, is the flow speed. And I love the detail on this one. This is great for controlling color maps, and you could set it up for mixing different surfaces using it as an alpha. So there's some cool stuff in there. Flow surface we looked at already. And here's the sediment. And the sediment's basically cut off a bit. And we take a look, we have too much of an extension, and we have a gray, which makes it a little hard for distribution. So if I just go ahead and kind of clip that out so we can see what it looks like, and I'm not going to save it at this point, but we can see an entirely different type of output that we can use to control the material, or of course use it within the terrain editor itself. You'll also notice sometimes that you've got this kind of sphere in the middle. So you might need to edit that out, and most of these outputs, with exception to the elevation, have that. If I modify this one, we might be able to see it as well in the center, just a little bit right in the middle. And you can see that dot. And I believe that's because it's probably processing from the center outward, and that might be what's causing that. Now, these images I processed individually and exported them from the terrain editor. And I'm going to show you how I did that. And there's a couple of different ways to export these, but what I did was I took the altitude and connected that out, and might as well just apply this to the fractal. You can see what it looks like. But what I did was individually went one by one. So I took the altitude, and I go ahead and turn off wireframe. And then I went and exported it, as I showed you before. And then what I did was processed it, the other outputs, by connecting to, in this case, the flow surface. And then I exported that out. And then I went to flow speed, and just one by one continue to do that. And we can see these different outputs showing up. Now, once you reach higher levels, from what I've noticed, I think it's anything above 2K, might be 4K. What happens is the preview you get in the terrain editor is not processed yet. And because this is lower resolution, it's going to show up a little better. But what you'll notice is once you hit 4K, you're going to have a really pixelated look because it's not processed yet. So what you have to do in order to get it to process is to just render the scene. And you could just do a preview render. Once you do that and open up the terrain editor, then you're going to get a nice crisp preview of the terrain, and then you can export it from there. Now, because I was working with 8K with these other images, it did take 20 minutes per image, so it did take a little while. Now, another thing you could do to export is if I was to have different material layers, go to Paint, and let's go ahead and just add another layer. And I'm just going to set it to manual for now, discard the alpha. And once you have, if you have these connected to anything from the altitude production, so using that erosion, and this is not set up for what we had before for the erosion, once you render it, it should bake all of those and process them. If it doesn't, then you can go through one by one. But anyway, what we can do down here is export all of the alpha maps. So that makes it a little easier if you want to just export each individual layer separately that's being controlled by those outputs. And once again, with the erosion nodes, if you bake them like this, you have to wait for View to load in and store the images to the memory. It may not if it's not incorporated into the scene file when you save it, then you may not see an increase in file size too much, but it does take a little while to load the scene, and it depends on whether or not you're doing animation or stills. For animation, sometimes it's easier just to bake things out. Also, if you don't feel that you're getting enough resolution out of the terrain, if you're using the procedural, this doesn't apply for the height field. If you were to use this and set it up the same way with the image, and you could just keep increasing the resolution up to the image size or whatever you want it to be. Then you can just increase the quality boost, and I don't have to worry about it too much for this because it's just processing an image that's already there. I am going to reset that material. Let's just go ahead and load one in. And then let's take a look at a quick render here. Okay, so here is final render quality. The bump map itself makes it hard to see the detail of the terrain. So I am going to reset the material. But that's one cool thing you can do, is use the bump map to make it look like it's a higher resolution. And just go ahead and render this with just a reset material, just very basic. Okay, so now we can see it without the bump map. Now I am zoomed in pretty far. If I go out further, we're going to see it a lot crisper. It's going to look a lot nicer. So now we can see it a little bit better there. And it looks like rendering possibly at a lower resolution than the image. Another thing you might have noticed is we've got this really sharp edge here. So I'm actually glad I went ahead and zoomed out, because that can happen when you're using an image to control a terrain. And we just need to nudge it a little bit, or just scale it by a tiny amount possibly to get rid of that. And I'll show you how to do it. So let's go into the terrain here. Go into that image. Even though I have repeat on, it's still giving us that huge edge. And possibly if we use mirror, it'll get rid of it. Because what's happening is it's different heights on each side when it repeats. So let's just take a look at mirror and see if it gets rid of it. And that was one easy way to do it. So in this case, it did remove it. If you don't want it to repeat, though, for some reason, if that happens, what you can do is just go into the scale and just change it by a little tiny bit, just to scale it up. And if you need to, you can do a tiny bit of image offset, but that'll allow it to center afterwards using the offset. But mirror looks like it's working pretty well right now. It's because when it processes, it usually offsets it by about a pixel. Now, as I was saying before, it might not be rendering full quality. So let's take a look at using this with a height field terrain, just copying the function. I'm going to go ahead and add in height field terrain, open that up, and paste the function. And then what we can do is just manually size it up. So we can use the resize terrain tool rather than just continually dividing step by step. So it would be 8,192, and it might not let me go that high. We'll just have to see. Sometimes it stops at 8. So I just entered that in, and now I just have to wait for it to process, and it shouldn't take that long because it's just using an image. Now we can look at the top and we can see that it did stop at 8,096 by 8,096, so I wasn't able to get completely up to it. Right now, also, the height of the terrain doesn't really show any detail. I'm going to go ahead and select that terrain. And scale it up. And I'll just go ahead and delete the procedural. And now we should see the full resolution. And there we go. We can see the image. And one thing it did when I resized it was change the scale up to 31 kilometers, which should originally was 1 kilometer, which is probably why it had no depth. So I'm just going to go ahead and scale that down. I also want to make sure that it didn't modify the image at all, essentially repeating itself within the terrain. Whoop. And it doesn't look like it's doing that at all. So now we can see the full resolution in the terrain editor. Once you start getting up to 8K, things do kind of slow down a bit. I don't suggest painting on it. That would be using a lot of resources. Vue kind of has a hard time handling high polygon amounts, at least for the previews, and especially in the terrain editor. With ecosystems, it handles billions of polygons, no problem. But when it comes to actual geometry that's not instances, then it can have a little bit of trouble once you start getting up here. Because right now we've got 131 million polygons, and although the OpenGL isn't displaying that much, at least within the scene, within the terrain editor, it is, and it starts to slow down a little. So hopefully this helps give you a better understanding of what you can get out of the new erosion nodes, because they do bring features to Vue that it has been lacking for quite some time. And usually terrains are imported in from other programs if you're looking for this kind of erosion. And it does add a lot of power to Vue. And now I'm going to show you how you can use one of those image outputs in order to control the material. And we're going to use the flow depth. And we're just going to work with this and use one of those other images we took a look at earlier, just so you get an idea how to set this up if you haven't done it before. So first I'm going to start with the base layer. And this is going to be the one I want to have all the nice little flow channels and stuff coming through on. So I'm going to do that with a lighter surface. And let's go ahead and I'm going to choose something a little lighter. And I'll go to the Material Companion 2, go to Stone. Let's do Light Gray Rock. Let's see how that shows up in the preview. It should be light enough for it to show through once I put a darker surface on top. So this is just a preview render quality, so it is a little grainy with just that surface. And now let's go ahead and edit the material, and I'm not going to use the terrain editor for this. I'm going to set this up manually. So what I want to do is I want to avoid that load time with that recent file and use the system browser, and then add in the surface, the darker surface that I want. Go ahead and load a layer in. Actually, first, before I change that, and like I said, some things it's easier to use the system browser with, and other things it isn't. So when I load the material, I'm going to keep it with the Vue browser first. And let's see here. And I'm going to use something from the original Material Companion, Landscape, and I'm going to use the dirt variations. I'm going to set the alpha boost, which in this case usually goes to 50%, so it does show through the surface below it. I turn down my highlights a little to 1%. And then we can set up our alpha. So I'm going to edit the function, and we're going to zoom in a little on this alpha. And right now, it'll probably be connected to a random color map, which it is, and nothing's really getting through there. So we're going to add in a projected texture map. And now if I use just this texture map by itself, and one thing I just remembered is that a few versions ago, actually quite a few versions ago, there used to be the ability to lock an image to the size of the object. At one point they removed it when they revamped all the texture maps. So even if I use a projected texture map and set the mapping mode to object parametric, it will continue to be modified by the scale within the scene. Now what we could do is just increase the scale by, in this case, 10, so the image would be 10 times larger. But then we got to go through and we got to adjust the offset, the image offset, and line it up properly. So I'm actually going to delete that projected texture map, and I'm going to show you a little trick to get a texture map node that will lock itself to the terrain no matter what size it is, no matter what size the material is. And this is also really useful if you are using say normal maps on something and you want to mix a procedural together, but you don't want to have to keep scaling the texture. So in order to get this node, what we need to first do is I'm just going to add in a new terrain, and then I'm going to add a material. I'll do manually define it. Just going to choose anything, discard the alpha channel, ignore the turbulence on this one, and then I just need to paint something in, just a little, just to get an image map. So just a little bit of painting, click OK, and this is going to add in, if we go to edit material, alpha production, it's going to add the texture scale node. Now in of itself, it's going to be a little complicated because it's tied directly to the way the terrain is set up. So what we need to do is actually go into the meta node, and we're going to extract the layer painting. So the layer painting node will automatically lock it in place, which isn't always the case with the normal projected texture map. This thing has something internally that the automatic UV in here is different from the automatic UV of a normal projected texture map. Not really sure why. So what I want to do is just copy, so Control C, and I'm going to add in a filter, and then paste in that node, remove any connection to it. I'm going to clear any image that's in there. I also want to make sure that I right click and make sure that these parameters are not published. And then I'm just going to select these two, create a meta node, and then save that meta node. And I'm just going to call this, and I already have this saved out, as fixed scale alpha. I'm going to go ahead and cancel. So we can load this in at any time, edit, or you can just ungroup it wherever you want it. So now that I have that saved, I'm going to close this out, delete that new terrain, go into this one, and we can edit the material, go into the alpha production, and then what we can do is load in the meta node, fixed scale alpha. I'm going to ungroup it, which is going to give us that layer painting. Connect the alpha to it, grayscale output, and then we can load in our image. And so now I'm going to go in to the options and use the system browser, load that in. What I'm going to use is the flow depth, and I've got two different versions. I've got one with 0 edges and one with, I've got no 0, so it's no 0 edges, and I'm going to select the flow depth, and you can see the difference in size between the compressed version. 768 for the non-compressed version, and with PIS based wavelet 501. Go ahead and load that in, and this might take a sec because it's a big image, so I'm going to let that process. And now that is loaded in, it is locked in place, and it's controlling our material distribution. So let's go ahead and take a look at a render. And here we can see that the flow depth creates a pretty cool material distribution. And this is just by itself, no modifications to the output. And there is one thing I want to note. I talked before about how I exported and processed each of the outputs as altitude. I also used the auto mapping node when I did that as the node just before the output node for the altitude. And that way it made it extend to the bounds of 0 or -1 to 1, which is full black and white. And then if we wanted to change it, tweak it, we can use, in this case, I've got exported images, which work well for alphas. And they don't necessarily have to be 32-bit either. So we can always edit the alpha to make the lines thinner if needed, or use a different map with it. So it's a very cool new feature in Vue.